Margaret Holloway stood frozen, her mouth agape, the garden shears dangling from her limp fingers. The zip ties were still in her left hand, black, industrial strength, and incriminating. Across from her, Assistant Commissioner Robert Chen was taking pictures with his phone, his face a mask of cold fury. "For the record, Mrs. Holloway," he said in a voice that could freeze lava, "that's my daughter you've restrained to the community fence. My disabled daughter." 15 minutes earlier, Margaret, known throughout Sycamore Heights as HOA Karen, had been conducting her usual Saturday morning patrol. As the president of the Homeowners Association, she considered herself the guardian of property values and community standards. Her clipboard contained 18 violations she'd documented since breakfast. Then she'd spotted the girl in the wheelchair by the decorative fence, reaching through the wrought iron to touch the prize-winning roses Margaret had planted last spring. Technically, those roses were in the common area, but everyone knew Margaret had won Best Community Garden Feature 3 years running. "Excuse me, those are prize specimens," Margaret had called out, quickening her pace. The girl, perhaps 16, had dark hair and almond-shaped eyes that widened with alarm. She tried to wheel backward, but her chair had become caught in the mulch. "I'm sorry," the girl stammered. "They're so beautiful. I just wanted to feel them." "Those roses cost the HOA $400, Margaret said, ignoring the girl's apology. "Who are you? I don't recognize you as a resident. I'm Lily Chen. My dad's house is..." "Chen? There's no Chen in our directory." Margaret's eyes narrowed suspiciously. An unauthorized visitor touching the community roses was a double violation. "We just moved in last week on Maple Drive. The Sorensens' old place. They never filed proper paperwork for a sale." Margaret pulled out her phone. "I need to call security." "Please don't. My dad will be here any minute. He just went to get something from the car." But Margaret was already dialing. As she waited for an answer, she noticed the girl reaching for the roses again. "Stop that this instant." She abruptly ended the call. "I'm sorry, they remind me of my mom's garden, before she died." Something in Margaret's mind short-circuited. In that moment, she wasn't seeing a grieving teenager. She was seeing a threat to community standards. The zip ties she used for garden maintenance were in her pocket. Before rational thought could intervene, she had secured the girl's wheelchair to the fence. "There. Now you'll stay put until we sort this out." The girl's face had crumpled. "You can't do this. This is a violation of HOA rules, young lady. Section 8, paragraph 12. No unauthorized persons shall interfere with community landscaping." And that's when Assistant Commissioner Robert Chen had appeared, his police badge gleaming in the morning sun, his phone camera documenting everything. Now, Margaret stood motionless as neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Dyers from across the street gasped audibly. Ted Williams, Margaret's staunchest HOA ally, turned away in embarrassment. "Margaret," her husband Frank whispered, having rushed over from their house. "What have you done?" Robert Chen knelt beside his daughter, gently cutting the zip ties with a pocket knife. "Lily, are you okay?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. Chen stood, pocketing his phone. "Mrs. Holloway, you've just restrained a minor against her will. That's false imprisonment. You've also violated the Americans with Disabilities Act." Margaret's world tilted sideways, but she was touching the roses. She whispered, knowing immediately how pathetic it sounded. Chen's gaze was unyielding. "I've documented everything, and you should know. I'm not just Lily's father. I'm the newly appointed Assistant Commissioner for Community Relations with the State Police." Margaret Holloway, who had ruled Sycamore Heights with clipboard and rulebook for 7 years, felt her carefully constructed reality begin to crumble beneath her sensible gardening shoes. 3 months later, Margaret stood before Judge Eleanor Winters, waiting for the sentencing decision. The plea deal had reduced the charges to misdemeanor reckless endangerment, but the possibility of jail time still loomed. Robert Chen had been surprisingly fair in his testimony. The defendant's actions were inexcusable, he'd stated, but her subsequent behavior demonstrates genuine remorse and commitment to change. Margaret had indeed changed. Weekly therapy sessions with Sonia Diaz had excavated the roots of her controlling behavior, from childhood trauma to the grief of multiple miscarriages that she'd never properly processed. The HOA had become her surrogate child, the rules her way of creating order from chaos. Mrs. Holloway, Judge Winters said, "This court sentences you to 1 year probation and 200 hours of community service, to be served at the West Side Center for Inclusive Recreation, a facility for children with disabilities." Margaret nodded, accepting the sentence with relief and trepidation. Outside the courthouse, Robert Chen approached her. "The center needs help with their garden program," he said. "I suggested you might have relevant skills." Margaret's eyes widened. "You recommended me? After what I did?" "Lily asked me to," he replied simply. "She believes in second chances." 2 weeks later, Margaret arrived at the center, nervous but determined. The director led her to the greenhouse where several teenagers in wheelchairs were attempting to repot plants, soil spilling everywhere. Among them was Lily Chen. "Mrs. Holloway will be helping with the gardening program," the director announced. The teens regarded her skeptically. Margaret didn't blame them. "I know nothing about adaptive gardening," she admitted. "But I'm a quick learner if you'll teach me." To her surprise, Lily wheeled forward. "We can learn together. I've been researching raised garden beds." That afternoon, Margaret drove to the lumber store and spent her own money on materials. By the following week, she constructed 6 wheelchair-accessible planting stations. The triumph on the teens' faces when they successfully grew their first seedlings awakened something long dormant in Margaret's heart. As spring approached, Lily suggested an ambitious project, entering the county garden competition as a team. Margaret hesitated. Competitions had always triggered her worst controlling tendencies. "I don't think I should be in charge," she said carefully. "You won't be," Lily replied with a grin. "I will, but we need your expertise." Under Lily's leadership, the center's garden flourished with vibrant flowers and vegetables. Margaret found herself enjoying the collaborative process more than she'd ever enjoyed her solitary gardening victories. The day before the competition, disaster struck. Spring storms flooded the garden, destroying weeks of work. The teens were devastated. "We'll withdraw," Margaret said, surveying the damage. "No," Lily insisted. "We'll adapt, just like we do every day." Through the night, they worked, salvaging plants, creating a stunning display of resilience from the wreckage. Their entry, titled "After the Storm," featured damaged plants artfully arranged to showcase nature's capacity for recovery. They didn't win first place, but their judges' special recognition for Most Inspirational Garden felt more meaningful than any blue ribbon in Margaret's trophy case. That evening, as Margaret helped clean up, Robert Chen arrived to pick up his daughter. "Quite a transformation," he observed, gesturing at both the garden and Margaret herself. "It's strange," Margaret replied. "I spent years trying to control everything, and I've never felt less in control than these past months. Yet somehow, I'm happier." Robert nodded. "Lily mentioned the HOA is holding elections next month." Margaret tensed. "I'm not interested in that position anymore." "Actually," he said, "some neighbors have suggested a joint presidency, you and Barbara Collins working together. They value your organizational skills, but want a more balanced approach." "I don't deserve a second chance with the HOA," Margaret said softly. "Perhaps not, but communities like gardens need tending." He handed her an envelope. "This is Lily's recommendation letter. She's quite persuasive." As the Chens left, Margaret remained in the garden twilight, considering possibilities she'd never imagined 3 months ago. The rigid structures she'd once clung to had crumbled, yet somehow she felt more secure standing amid the beautiful uncertainty. The woman who had once zip-tied a disabled girl to a fence was gone. Who she was becoming remained an unfinished story, one she was, at last, curious rather than fearful to discover. By Monday morning, Margaret Holloway's name was trending on 3 social media platforms. The video, captured by not just Robert Chen, but also 3 neighbors, had gone viral overnight. HOA Karen zip-teased disabled teen blared the headlines, followed by a tsunami of outraged comments. Margaret sat in her living room, blinds drawn, watching her phone explode with notifications. The HOA emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 that evening. She'd already received 14 texts demanding her resignation. "You need a lawyer," Frank said, pacing the room. After 30 years of marriage, this was the first time Margaret had seen genuine anger in his eyes. "What were you thinking, Maggie?" "I wasn't," she admitted, her voice small. It was like something took over. All I could see was a rule being broken. Frank stopped pacing. "This isn't about rules. It's about what you've become." The words stung because they rang true. When had she transformed from the woman who once organized neighborhood welcome baskets into someone who measured brass with a ruler? When had her clipboard become a weapon? The doorbell rang, making Margaret jump. Frank peered through the peephole. "It's Barbara from next door," he said, surprised. Barbara Collins had been Margaret's closest friend until last month's confrontation over Barbara's unapproved bird feeder. Now she stood on the porch, holding a casserole dish. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," Barbara said when Frank opened the door. Her eyes found Margaret on the couch. "The internet mob is brutal. They don't know you like we do." "The internet mob is right," Margaret whispered. "I zip-tied a disabled girl to a fence, Bob." Barbara set the casserole on the coffee table. "Yes, and it was inexcusable. But I also remember when you sat with me for 3 days after my mastectomy." "People are complicated, Mags." The phone rang. Margaret's sister calling from Phoenix. "Have you lost your mind?" Claire demanded without preamble. "Mom's spilling in her grave." Their mother, a special education teacher for 40 years, had instilled in both daughters a fierce protectiveness toward children with disabilities. Margaret felt sick remembering her mother's passionate advocacy. "I don't know what happened to me," Margaret said, tears finally breaking through. "I've become some kind of monster." Later that afternoon, as Margaret was drafting her resignation letter, another unexpected visitor arrived. Sonia Diaz, the neighborhood's newest resident, and the first person Margaret had cited for excessive holiday decorations last Christmas. "I'm not here to pile on," Sonia said, settling into an armchair. "I'm a therapist, and I recognize a breakdown when I see one." Margaret blinked in surprise. "A breakdown? When was the last time you did something that wasn't about rules or control? When did joy last enter this house?" The question landed like a physical blow. Margaret couldn't remember. "The HOA became your identity," Sonia continued gently. "And identities built on power rarely serve us well in the end." That evening, Margaret entered the community center to dead silence. 40 pairs of eyes tracked her movement to the podium. She placed her resignation letter on the table, but didn't immediately speak. Instead, she looked around the room at her neighbors, people whose lives she'd intruded upon with regulations and citations. Robert and Lily Chen sat in the back row, their expressions carefully neutral. "I've prepared a statement," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "But first, I need to say something without notes." She turned directly to the Chens. "What I did was unforgivable. There's no justification, no HOA rule that could ever make it right. Lily, I am deeply, profoundly sorry." The teenager's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent. Margaret continued, addressing the room. "I've lost perspective on what matters. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that property values were more important than people." Her voice broke. "I'm resigning effective immediately, and I'll be seeking professional help to understand why I acted so abhorrently." As she gathered her belongings to leave, Robert Chen approached the podium. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "What you did was wrong, but your acknowledgement matters. The legal consequences are still coming. Actions have consequences. But I see a person who might be worth more than her worst moment." Margaret nodded, unable to speak through her tears. As she walked toward the exit, Lily Chen's soft voice stopped her. "The roses really are beautiful," the girl said. "They remind me of my mother's garden too."